Approved. 1080 high definition. We have our little counter of eyeballs going here now. Got our first viewer now and starting to tick up here.
Hey, Rob, are you doing this on Facebook as well?
Yep, it is streaming to Facebook and YouTube. All right. All right, well, we're starting to get a few more people in here, so I think we are ready to kick ourselves off. So welcome again to everybody who's watching. If you're watching this live or if you are watching this on replay, we're happy to have you joining us here. So this is a continuation of our live online wargaming program. We began this game that we're playing tonight. We played it in our first session last month, and hopefully some of you were able to catch that and see what's happened here to go over those the developments up to this point in case you haven't seen them. But I just want to go through and introduce ourselves again. My name is Rob Doan. I'm the curator for the Naval War College Museum, and I am playing the Japanese side in this game here tonight. My opponent is AJ Orlikoff from the National Museum of the U.S. Army. He is representing the boys in the black and gold tonight.
That's right.
AJ is the education specialist lead at the National Museum. So welcome again, AJ. Glad to have you with us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
And on color commentary and play-by-play tonight is, again, Mark Stanovich, an associate professor with the Wargaming Department at the Naval War College, who is heavily involved in professional wargaming and is going to take us through a brief AAR when we're done with this game here tonight. So welcome again, Mark. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Great. So, again, we're doing this just to give everybody a little bit of sense of what wargaming is all about. We're not able to show you an actual war game that's played at the Naval War College, but we're able to get closer to it by playing a commercial war game like this and just talk about some of the basic ideas and concepts that are present in games at just about any level. So this game, to kind of bring you up to speed again, we started this last month. This is a game that's based or set in World War II at the end of the Guadalcanal campaign. It's called Operation K, which is the Japanese plan to withdraw the last of their forces off of the island once they realized that they weren't going to be able to retake the island and get Henderson Field again. So this is in February of 1943. We started this off as a 12-turn game, and we're using this game called Order of Battle, which is a game that's available on Steam. If you want to check it out and see exactly how this game works, you can download it there. It's a free download, so feel free to check it out if you're curious. But this game is 12 turns long. We played the first 4 turns in our first session last month. And in the intervening time, AJ and I actually played the middle part of this game out offline. And we've been posting some videos of those middle turns. So hopefully you got a chance to see those on the museum's Facebook page. If you didn't and you want to go check those out, you can find them on our Facebook page or on YouTube, and you can get up to date. But we're going to give you kind of a brief, just quick recap of what has happened up to this point. And then AJ and I are going to jump in and play the final 3 turns live here and see who's going to come out on top. So AJ, I have to admit that you are definitely getting the best of me up to this point. So that the basic setting for our scenario is that the Japanese have 4 understrength battalions and 1 decent battalion on the island that are just trying to evacuate and get off, and their mission is to survive to the end of the game. They can do that either by hiding out on the island and still being alive at the end of the game, or by actually getting on the transports and leaving. And whereas I started out with 5 of those units, AJ, you have eliminated 4 of them, and 1 of them, I believe, is stuck on a mountaintop, completely surrounded by American ground units.
That's about right. That sounds about right.
it's not looking great for the boys on the ground. So my hope, I think my only hope at this point, is what's going to be happening out at sea. So this scenario is a hypothetical scenario, although that portion on ground is playing out, or at least the setup for it is what it was in the historical setting. The piece at sea is much more hypothetical because, in fact, the Americans didn't try to interfere with this withdrawal. The intelligence officers who were intercepting Japanese radio traffic didn't really get the right message in terms of what the Japanese plan was. They thought that the Japanese were preparing for a big counterattack, and they advised Admiral Halsey and his staff that that was the case. And so everybody played it out more cautious than they did in this scenario. So we're kind of taking our jump off point for this scenario as if the Navy did read the signals correctly and interpreted them correctly and decided to be much more aggressive about interfering with this operation. So everything you're seeing at sea is much more of a what if kind of a scenario. So we have had a little bit of a small engagement over towards where the evacuation area was, AJ, and you've been kind of beating up on. I had used a few of my ships to try and screen the Japanese withdrawal from those ground units, but unfortunately, your aircraft, you sent some some torpedo and dive bombers over, and they were able to get a free run at those Japanese transports. And I had, I think, 2 ground units that made it to the ships, but you promptly sank them before they were almost even out of sight.
They didn't make it very far.
No, they did not. So
and
victory.
The thing about this scenario, and the interesting wrinkle is that there is a secondary objective on your side. So just like in the real world and just like in real life, if that the Americans, they go on this operation for these Japanese ground forces, but they're committing carriers and capital ships and battleships and things that are super valuable to the war effort. If they lose 1 or 2 of those carriers, it's not going to be really worth it to chase off those Japanese ground forces who are already tattered and just worn down by months and months of fighting in the jungle. That it's not going to be worth the exchange, trading a carrier for those ground forces.
Right.
So Rob, you can still win. In fact, I think that was your plan, was to use that to lure me in. But I suppose we will see, though, if these last 3 turns. I think the real question is not so much what happens on the ground; it's if your naval forces can sink a carrier.
I think you're right. Yeah, you if you've seen the video replays, you know that there is a Japanese airstrike coming in. There are 2 Japanese carriers in this scenario that have launched their aircraft, and they're coming in. And the question is just going to be if I can sink that capital ship, because if I don't, I think you've got the game in the bag. So that's where we're at.
We'll see. Absolutely. I'm very much looking forward to Professor his commentary, because I have a very large ego. I'm proud to represent the Army, and I want to hear all about how my Army plan was superior to your Navy plan. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about that, and can't wait.
All right, I'm gonna kick I think over the screen over to you, AJ, here. So here's where we are, and we are at the start of turn 10 out of our 12-turn game, and you move first at every turn. So
that's right.
You're free to move away.
So just to give folks an overview of sort of the general battlefield, we have the remaining ground unit here surrounded on some high ground. We have the American fleet here in the center, and then, as I'm now discovering, we have Japanese naval assets somewhere. We have a few over here, but somewhere, that are coming in to attack my fleet.
And we should add too, I know we're kind of watching this here, but normally when AJ and I are playing, you in the audience kind of get to see what's happening on both player turns here. I'm going to try to not pay too much attention to what you're doing, AJ, because the idea is that when it's our turn, the computer only shows us what units we could actually see in reality. So AJ, of course, can see where all of his ships are. I haven't spotted them all. So when it's my turn, I'm not going to have all those pieces on my map. I'm going to be working with some limited information there. So, and that is, I mean, the tension that sort of builds on that. That was one thing, Mark, I was curious about that I wanted to ask you. This game, obviously, this program is for educational purposes and for fun. But even as in the middle parts of these turns, when I was trying to find AJ's high value units, I guess you would say, those capital ships in the middle, and I couldn't find them. And I was starting to get nervous about, well, where are they? I'm wondering, in games at the War College, when you are running them, can you tell us anything about, the atmosphere in them? Like, how tense does it get with, professional players? Do you have arguments breaking out amongst the students about what to do? What is the mood like when they're making these decisions where, sure, it's not the real thing, but it's professional training, and they're being evaluated on it.
Well, a good deal of the players that we get in the games that the War College runs for the CNO are the actual fleets themselves, their staffs, their commanders. So they have an even bigger stake in the game than it would be if it was a player/training education audience. And it can be, we want the players to want to win. And winning is not necessarily the value that comes from their game, but it can get pretty tense. Not knowing in a closed intelligence game where you don't know, where there's uncertainty, and that uncertainty can at times represent a mortal threat to your force, it can get fairly tense. The players will look at their surveillance and reconnaissance plans very carefully. In many cases, they're looking to stretch fairly thin resources as far as they can, because they want to know as much of the important information of their battle space as they can possibly get. Much as the war game itself is a representation of war, a model of war, that becomes a model for a lot of the decisions they have to make. If there are areas in which they think they are under mortal threat, or they don't understand what the threat is, they're about to bring valuable naval forces capital ships, or what we would call today high value units, into restricted water space, those decisions tend to be pondered pretty carefully, and it can get pretty tense. We've had, I've been in rooms where we've had shouting matches between people with stars on their collars, and that's good. That is an environment in which people are professionally and emotionally engaged in what they're doing, and it tends to make learning a pretty high on the list value from the game. So it can be pretty intense in there at times.
Yeah, I can imagine. And with your games too, with professional games, I mean, AJ and I, of course, have all the time in the world to think about our moves. But in the games you run, the players have time limits, right? They can't just sit and think about it as long as they want.
Yeah, depending on the mechanics we run in the game, and we will choose them for some fairly specific reasons. A lot like actual warfare, there is very much a time crunch. In which the old saying, the perfect plan executed 2 days late is worthless, but a mediocre plan executed violently when you need it is worth its weight in gold. The same is really true in the games that they play too. A decision in which commanders clearly state their intent. The players on their subordinate staffs understand what they're doing, and write clear and concise orders to move their pieces and conduct the kinds of operations that cause them to execute the commander's intent. That all takes a lot of time, and when time is compressed like that, nerves can fray. People can get a little hot under the collar. But yeah, there are some limitations to how much you can compress that time frame, because if you compress it too much, there's none of that rich discussion that the war game is there to promote. But they know that they're under the gun, and they know that they are in a rapid decision-making cycle, and it's good training for them. It's good habits of mind for them to understand that they don't have all day, and if the enemy's inside of their tempo, inside of their OODA loop, It's going to be a long process.
Over to you, Rob.
All right, time to.
Good turn for the Navy, U.S. Navy, and for the U.S. Army on my side. Iron Bottom Sound lived up to its name.
Get a dose of bad news here. Let's see how bad it got. So I'm just playing through the replay of everything that AJ just did. It shows me a little replay of what he's got. So yeah, I'm pretty sure it looks like the Japanese cruiser here that was part of the screening force is now part of that artificial reef that's down there in Iron Bottom Sound. Yeah.
That's right.
All right. And predictably, the last looks like you have secured Guadalcanal Island, AJ. It looks to me like well done.
Looks to me like credit to the 23rd and the 25th, and of course the Marines. So
at this point, you have destroyed all 5 Japanese units, and that is the end of the Japanese Army presence on the island. So if I'm going to do anything at this point, it looks like it is definitely, it's got to be at sea.
Did see your airstrike coming in, though. Very sneaky. Now, one of the tactics, the proper strategies, I should say, that the Japanese did, and I believe you're mirroring that, Rob, we were discussing offline about how you did a strategy where you divided your forces in like a very complex arrangement, sort of this symphony of different elements operating all at once. And that's very reminiscent of a lot of Japanese planning. Rob, can you speak to, or Professor Stanovich, can you speak to any instances where the Japanese did use intricate planning to success and possibly to failure?
That was as you highlighted, AJ, that was a characteristic of Japanese, particularly execution in the Japanese Navy. The IJN was very fond of complex plans in which there were at times several dependent operations. Midway was certainly one of those. It had a component that went into the Aleutians, probably not worth the expenditure of resources away from the main fight. When they were unchallenged in the Pacific in the early days of the war, they got away with it. Their operations around Borneo and down Malaya are a really good example of how they could get away with it because they really were virtually unchallenged. The ABDA had almost nothing at sea or in the air to challenge them after the first week or two of the war. As it became a little bit more of an even fight, the interdependence of the operations, as we all know in war, nothing ever goes as planned. And if it's a bottom-to-top operation and something fails, it's failure for everything. And they found that out sort of the hard way, but it was so ingrained in their planning and in some cases their military culture that they kept it up even as late as Lady Gulf. They had an extremely complex plan. It almost paid dividends because of some decisions Halsey made, but in reality, I think an American would look at that, an American naval officer would look at that and recognize it as a dilution of strength. Had they had Center Force and Southern Force and Northern Force as a single force, they may have been able to accomplish a lot more. Instead, the United States Navy, more than one occasion, destroyed them in detail or prevented one from supporting another, which left them at a disadvantage in a combat power ratio. They were brilliant tactically. They had very good ships. Their gunnery was excellent. They had wonderful night fighting, night combat capabilities at sea. Operationally, they were wanting. They, I'm not sure, had quite the understanding. Well, I'm not sure we did either at that point, but they did not have quite the understanding of how tactics supported operations that we sort of instinctively came to know. And they never really got the chance.
Right.
And this is Guadalcanal, the evacuation of Guadalcanal is probably the most brilliant of their Guadalcanal efforts. It was very successful. And I don't know if it paid a whole bunch of dividends, as we said in the last online session. Very few of the men who came off the island ever were inserted into a combat unit again. But it was brilliantly done. The deception, the operations, the right platforms for the right jobs. Tactically, it was brilliant. Operationally, I don't think it made any difference.
And I think something you just said, I think really rings true, at least to me in my studies in this, is the deception aspect of this. Is so much of this careful planning relies upon deception. And as soon as American naval intelligence reaches a certain level where they're breaking the Japanese naval code, it really appears they, like, as you said, Professor, the entire apparatus of their operational capabilities falls apart. So I think that's really, it's a key aspect to it, was deception. It's from the very beginning of the war with Pearl Harbor and the attack on the Philippines.
Yeah, their ability to deceive us drops precipitously when we really begin to grow our naval, air, and land-based air power in the Pacific, and when our submarines really become more numerous in the waters of the Pacific. Somebody is going to see them somewhere, and that had happened over and over again. And of course, we did have the breaking of the Japanese codes and the great work that our code breakers did, which was added on top of that. Deception by the Japanese, absent an error in judgment by an American commander. What we're looking at here, the Operation K, was probably the last real major incident of the Japanese really deceiving us into thinking that they were doing something other than what they were doing. Because there's a difference between hiding and deceiving. Camouflage, being stealthy, is not necessarily deception. It's part of it, but it is not deception. Deception is making the enemy think you're doing something other than what you're doing.
Right. Yeah, now that I think about it, I'm trying to rack my brain for other possible successes. I think you may be right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that might have been the last one. All right, I'm loading up here. Let's see the damage that you do, Rob.
Well,
we
we definitely have action coming out there now in Iron Bottom Sound. So we were talking, I know, about the complex nature of the Japanese plan, and I think I said in one of the videos too that I admit I sort of, I almost tried to role play it a little bit in thinking about what would the Japanese high command do if they had been presented with this situation. And yeah, like we said, probably something with multiple converging pieces coming together. And I think my goal in all this was to try, trying to mass everything at once and having it all hit at once is always kind of an ideal, an ideal they teach you in military settings is when you're have multiple assets, multiple weapons coming in. If they hit at the same time, it has just an even bigger effect than if it happens individually. So part of it is trying to get all of the the aircraft, the gunfire, the submarines to hit you all at about the same time. And
well, goodness,
they aren't all coming together right at the same time, but it's getting close. So I feel good about that.
I'm in a little more hot water than I expected.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, you got a carrier hurt really bad.
The submarines took some shot at. I didn't look to see if that's Enterprise or Saratoga that they're shooting at there. I think it's the Enterprise. Yeah, it is. It looks like from the superstructure. Yeah.
Yes, that is.
I have to tell you, if they sink the most storied ship of World War II in the U.S. Navy, that's you may have something to answer for there, AJ.
Right. I better sink these subs. That's number one. That should take care of that one. Okay.
I did have a bit of a decision to make. I think it was maybe 2 turns ago or so, one of my submarines got a hit on one of your battleships. And looking at my aircraft and the amount of time that's left in the game, the one thing I realized is that they're really only going to have time to try and really attack one of those capital ships. And I was sitting there thinking, should I choose to go after an aircraft carrier that hasn't been hit yet, or that battleship that has a hit on it already, but it's still a much tougher target to sink in the end. So you're doing a real good job, I think, of keeping all of your capital ships together there in the middle, and you've got a lot of supporting ships around them to help with anti-aircraft fire and things like that. So you definitely have the circle the wagons approach going pretty well here. But
Yeah.
Well, it's funny you should mention circle the wagons. Some of the things that came out of the interwar wargaming period that was also blended with the fleet problems that were done between the wars were the formations around the carriers, and it was a circle the wagons. It was that circle formation that, you know, you probably have as close as you're going to get on a hexagonal board, but having the protective screen of the smaller ships, followed by the somewhat larger ships, followed by the heavy cruisers and battleships that provided anti-aircraft protection for the carriers. That was a formation that we excelled at that the Japanese did not. And as soon as we had an opportunity to have the requisite numbers of fast cruisers, destroyers, and the faster battleships, even though the South Dakota class couldn't really keep up with the faster carriers, it was still 27, 28 knots. Carriers became a little bit harder target for the Japanese at a time where the Japanese didn't necessarily have as much capital to spend in the air to go get them. There were some successes with submarines, and of course, later on in the war with the kamikaze, the suicide tactics. But our circular formations was something that very much came out of both the war games and the fleet problems as they ran them as complementary intellectual and warfighting exercises.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. I mentioned that in one of the mid-game videos on turn 6 or 7. I know I had mentioned that because AJ, you had a really, I mean, it was actually geographically almost, you had a good circle going on, or at least a half circle, where it looked like you were doing exactly that. So yeah, that's it played out very well. Here we got a good question here about asking about losses in the battle. The question is regarding the ships that were lost. How important was it for both Japan and the U.S. to replace their losses in ships and aircraft? And did either side's manufacturing abilities impact the significance of Guadalcanal?
That's a terrific question. Guadalcanal, the Solomon campaigns at writ large, really, in my opinion anyway, became the turning point. We tend to focus on Midway because it was such an unlikely outcome. But it was really the grinding of the Solomon's campaign, starting with Guadalcanal, that would turn the tide for good. As an example, between Pearl Harbor and the end of the Solomon's campaign and the beginning of Cartwheel in New Guinea and New Britain in July of '43, the United States commissioned more warships in those 19 months than the Japanese would build in the entire war. And that would be only about 20% of the warships that we would end up building, not even counting the hundreds of attack transports and thousands of landing craft. Additionally, the aircraft losses were severe, and the disparity in aircraft manufacture grew, and it was particularly a disparity in pilots. The standard historical interpretation is we trained anywhere between 2.5 and 3 times the number of pilots the Japanese did, but even that's somewhat misleading. Toward the end of the war, the Japanese pumped out pilots that in some cases had fewer than 100 flight hours. If you use training flight hours as the coin of the realm, the disparity is somewhere around 14 to 1. And with the newer American fighters with the 2,000 horsepower engines that could really best anything in the sky, the Hellcats, the Corsairs, when kill ratios went up 12, 15, and in some cases 18 to 1, you could see how the Japanese naval air arm that had been the most competent, the most deadly air arm in the world, bar none, in January of 1942 is pretty much ground to a pulp by the end of 1943. There's almost nothing left of them. The rest of the war is a tale of half-trained pilots led by some veterans in substandard aircraft for the most part, being massacred by much more skilled American pilots flying infinitely superior aircraft. There are exceptions, of course. Some of the interceptors were quite good. They were built in the hundreds and not the tens of thousands. That's a great question. And the disparity in shipbuilding, the disparity in industrial capacity, the disparity in the training programs meant that from the Solomons forward, the Japanese were in a rather steep decline, whereas the Americans, able to hold out long enough, past October of 42, we're going to be in the ascent right up to the end of the war. So, great question.
Yeah. I think you're very accurate to point out Guadalcanal and the Solomon Island campaigns is a real inflection point between, them being maybe equal combatants, or maybe the Japanese slightly having an advantage, to really being an American advantage for the remainder of the war. One thing I always like to point people to is to understand how the Japanese fight is to even just look at their technology, their philosophies, even go out to their technology. The Japanese Zero, it's a plane with no armor. It's a plane with heavy cannons. It's a plane that is incredibly fast and agile. But because of their doctrine, they value the skill of the pilot and their ability to just be the superior warrior and outfight their opponent while they didn't need armor. Whereas the Americans go, well, we want to save our pilots' lives if they get shot at. We want to armor our planes, even though it'll take something away from their maneuverability. It just speaks to even just if you look at the planes, it speaks to the two different cultures that are spawning these forces that are fighting it out in the 1930s.
There is a cognate of that on the ground as well. The Japanese army did not believe in supplying their army forces with the best weapons. They had some, the Arisaka rifles of various calibers were good. Some of their machine guns were good. They had some mountain artillery that was dangerous in a jungle environment. But largely, the overwhelming firepower of the Americans defeated the Japanese, who believed that their fighting spirit, Bushido, could overcome the American technology and the American preponderance of firepower. As Roy Geiger said on Okinawa, I want to be lavish with my ammunition and stingy with the lives of my Marines. And that's the American way of war. If you talk about Wheatley's book, that's the American way of war. You shoot the living hell out of everything, and if necessary, drive over it if you have to. Now, we've gotten a little bit away from that because of our belief in some cases that war can be antiseptic. But believe me, that was a very, very effective way to wage war against the Japanese, and in some cases against the Germans.
That's a great point. So I hear Rob plotting over there. It's quiet. I know he's really plotting.
Sure. So for me, the key aspect that I think I alluded to in the mid-game turns too is I had put together this idea of bringing my aircraft in, and as you've been able to see, they are flying inbound, but they are they are arriving to the battle too late. I had wanted to sort of, again, spring this trap all at once and have them all arrive on target at the same time, and they almost are, but I think I would have benefited from launching these aircraft sooner than I actually did. So it's a case of probably should have done this a little bit earlier in the game, because they may just not arrive on target.
I'm not taking anything for granted at this point. I'll believe it when I see it. I'll believe it when I see it that my fleet is safe.
Let's see.
Yeah. Part of the strategy.
Yeah, basically, this is turn 11 here, so I'm going to have one turn. Well, here we go. At least one more who might be able to do something useful for me. All right, got in another hit here. So we've got the Enterprise, poor old Enterprise, that is continuing to take hits here, and it's a question of, it's got like 3 hits left that it can take, and the question is going to be, can it survive one more turn?
it really is coming down to the wire. I didn't expect it to be, but that ambush came in. Well done.
I am kicking it back over to you to head into the last turn here. Time to turn 12.
Okay.
Mark, in the professional games, how much time do you give them to plan in the beginning before you actually start playing? Because I imagine when these large team games, they must need quite a bit of time to digest the information and actually come up with a plan before you go to turn 1.
And we will often have games that are examining plans that are already written. So a lot of that, some of the commanders' decisions and the staff planning processes are more or less complete, or nearly so. But we will give them, one of the things that's a trick about wargaming professionally, with decisions being really the focus of the war game, is you want them to have as many decisions as possible, but you also have to give them enough time to competently and adequately do the things you're asking them to do. So it will depend on the size of the game units that we're playing. It will be very different if we have the task group is the highest level with a few ships, and we're really talking about individual ship action against an enemy asset, or if we're looking at a numbered fleet. Those are two very different games in the way in which they are designed for the mechanics. We'll give them what we think is sufficient time, and generally we'll work with a sponsor so that we make sure that what we're putting in front of them is a reasonable chance of being done. If we're asking them to do a game about life, love, death, and God, and we think they're going to get it done by Wednesday afternoon, it's not going to happen, right? So we want to make sure that we give them sufficient time to do the intellectual processes that the game's value comes from. And that's a bit of a trick. Everything's a clock penalty. The detail of adjudication, how it's reported out, having been an adjudicator so many times, a lot of times we're there until the wee hours of the morning getting ready for them to be able to grab their stuff at 8 o'clock and begin their move. And they're still not happy with it because everybody hates adjudication, right? We're not happy until you're not happy, kind of thing. But it becomes a very big consideration as we begin to build game processes. Are we giving them enough time to do the planning, to do the discussions, the execution, writing the orders? All this can't be done instantly, and time in a game is rather compressed anyway. So it's it will vary greatly, but we always have that as a guidepost. We make sure we give them enough time to do what we're asking.
Well, and I imagine the difficult thing is, AJ and I have an incredible luxury here where we have absolute unity of command, where it's just us with godlike powers over everything. So we don't have to convince our teammates of anything. We don't have to coordinate with a lot of other people and get everybody on the same page. It's very easy when you can make all the decisions. So I'm sure that slows down quite a bit the more people you have involved.
One of the interesting things that came out of the war games between the wars, I think we talked about this the last time. A good deal of it was getting commanders to understand the estimate of the situation. But it also had an aspect of orders writing. You needed to be clear and concise and use doctrinal language so that everybody understood what you mean. We, in this age of instant and unfettered communications, have in some cases gotten away from that. So there's a constant back and forth of, what do you mean, boss? What do you mean, boss? What do you mean, boss? Until he can finally clarify what he should have told him up front. If we restrict that communications so that he can't. In our Jutland game, Rob, I don't know if you remember the Jutland game, we had message pads.
Yes.
And they were always time late. They were always for the next turn.
Yeah.
And these people, who in some cases were naval officers, had a hard time making themselves understood on a piece of paper, as would have to have been done in 1916. You can see the shrugs across the room and the shaking of the heads. that was one thing that came out of the war games in interwar period, and it remains a feature of our games. If there is a really hosed up order that we get, unless there's a really compelling reason for us to have to fix it, and the people who are supposed to execute it don't understand it, we don't touch it. Mm-hmm. Because there's a lesson to be learned there. What do you mean you didn't understand? You asked me for dry water. How am I going to give you that? All of those kinds of things are exacerbated by not having the unity of command that, you guys are blowing each other up here, but you're the only one you have to consider. You already know what you mean. Making themselves understood to somebody in another room who's not in their thought process is sort of the trick to orders writing. It's the trick to being clear and concise so that you leave them enough time to do their planning. So we do quite a bit of that, actually. We make very much a note of that. And when we stray from doctrine and people don't understand because we'll note it. We'll note that.
Here's Julie, one of our in the audience, is asking again a follow-up. This is a good question. So have you ever had players or teams that just failed miserably and then failed to absorb the desired takeaways that you wanted them to learn from having failed? And if that did happen, then what happens in that instance?
Well, war games are the places to fail, and we will have them, quote unquote, fail all the time. We want the players to win. I shouldn't say it. We want the players to want to win. Whether or not they do win is immaterial to the outcome of the game. And that's where we still have some holdouts with that. We have players fail all the time. They have things happen where they didn't understand what red was doing and they get their backside handed to them. Most of them do a pretty good job learning.
Rob?
Some who are so wedded to their particular mental models sometimes don't. And sometimes they fail to realize that this is a two-sided, closed intelligence game in which the guy in the other room doesn't have to do what you think he's going to. And that can be a bit of an eye-opener. Most of the time, folks are very professional and they'll look at it and go, I thought he was doing this, or what I thought I understood, I didn't really understand. And we've had times where we've backed up and run a move again, and at times had it turn out catastrophe again, but that's okay. That's why we do this. As long as we can get the players and the commanders and the staffs to do some self-analysis and understand essentially why we think that failed, then the learning really does get done. And we don't sugarcoat anything. If there's bad news, we give it to them.
Well, Rob, I've turned over to watching your screen because there is nothing else I can do. But I'm a little worried about the Enterprise.
So yeah, I think it's worth it at this point to let's look at what's going on in the game here. So we have. Let's see, I'm going to zoom out a little bit just to get the overall game situation here. So at least what I can see of your fleet, AJ. So we've got kind of a wild scrum here going on. The fleets are starting to get kind of mixed out. But so I've got there are two Japanese battleships, the Kongo and the Haruna, coming down from the top here. AJ, you've got the bulk of your fleet is here in the middle. And I can see it's just off screen for me. I'm going to have to move one of my aircraft in here to come spot it, but I know the Enterprise is somewhere kind of right down in this area, and I think it's only got 3 or 4 hit points left. It might not be,
though. It might not be. You might want to go a different direction.
Maybe you did some emergency repairs. Yeah. So you did your last turn. This is my last turn. So this is all going to come down to whether I can sink the Enterprise or not. So, and people are, here's a comment too about how, that this is, again, a hypothetical scenario here. Yes, Halsey probably, we talk a little bit about, Monday morning quarterbacking and armchair admiraling and how, Halsey did get some criticism for not having done, some version of what we're doing here, at least of sending ships to try and cut off the Japanese retreat from Guadalcanal. And the fact that, yeah, I mean, in this, this is called the slot, and this particular piece of sea right here is Iron Bottom Sound that got its name because of how many ships sank in this area. But yeah, it would have been pretty dangerous to bring, not just one, but you've got 2 carrier task forces that are here in this, pretty constricted piece of water. And now, AJ, I know from having seen that, you've got there's Japanese ships over here, they're over here, and my carriers and destroyers are hiding out over here. So, they're they have enemy ships on all sides. It's not to say that they're necessarily trapped, because some of these forces of mine are fairly light, but it would be a very perilous situation if an American commander found himself with, battleships and aircraft carriers in a pretty small piece of sea.
Well, that's a great point, Rob. And it bears mentioning that there is a school of thought that really revolves around, even if Halsey knew that they were evacuating Guadalcanal, he wasn't going to risk his carriers to stop it. Because at this point in February of 43, there is no harbor anchorage at Ulithi. There is no real forward repair facilities. If he took substantial damage, there's no floating dry docks forward. If Enterprise took a torpedo or took sufficient battle damage, even if she wasn't sunk or Saratoga wasn't sunk, they are at least going back to Pearl Harbor. And if the damage is severe enough, they're going back to Puget Sound or San Diego. And they are out of action for months. And this is restricted water space, where one of your operational functions of movement and maneuver is fairly limited. They don't have to look a whole bunch of places to find you. Yes, the Japanese successfully evacuated. To borrow from the old Prussian Clausewitz, was the value of the object really sufficient to put the only 2 carriers you had in full operation to stop it? Mm-hmm. And, even if he had read the tea leaves right, if he had decided that the answer is no, that is not an unreasonable decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And AJ, I know you felt some of the consternation that that maybe he would have felt in this situation, when I know, by about the middle part of this game, you still had not found where my aircraft carriers and my battleships were.
Yeah, that was the danger, right?
I think that I hope that at least gave you some pause about wondering, I haven't found the main part of this fleet yet. All right, so AJ, I know you can look here, obviously, because I know your turns are done, so there's no harm in you seeing what I'm doing.
That's right, I'm watching.
One of my cruisers has a shot lined up on the Enterprise, so we're going to go ahead and fire away here, and let's see what he does.
He does not. Oh, no.
Oh, 2 points. No. Enterprise is down to 1 point left.
Not looking good.
Let's see. See who we got who can possibly finish the job here. So I've got one more light cruiser here. I'm going to come up this way. Well, it doesn't look like he's going to do any damage, but I may as well try anyway. Nope, didn't do anything. All right, let's move the battleships in. Let's see. Oh, we do have. Oh, I think this is going to do it, AJ.
No, you don't have to do it.
We have rounds landing on
battleships there. You might want to shoot them. There's another carrier.
All right, here we go. Oh no!
Oh no! That is an instant loss for the American player.
That is the battleship Haruna that just laid the killing blow on the Enterprise.
Professor Stanovich, do you recall any instance during World War II of Japanese surface ships closing in on aircraft carriers like this?
Yes, they weren't fleet carriers, but the guys off of Samar had themselves quite a morning, didn't they? When they look over the horizon, who the hell are those people with the tall pagodas?
Exactly. That's what I was fishing for. Yeah.
What is interesting though is if you put yourself before Pearl Harbor, if you put yourself in November of 1941, and you ask as to whether or not the battleship or the carrier has primacy, the jury was still out. Yes, there had been Japanese or Italian battleships sunk at Toronto, but they were at anchor. Glorious had been sunk by, Courageous had been sunk by gunfire. Ark Royal had been sunk by a submarine. Aircraft carriers themselves had proved themselves very, very vulnerable when they didn't have their aircraft up. And it was not until the war began to play out with more capable aircraft and better air defenses that aircraft carriers became survivable as a unit, as survivable as they were, at least toward the end of the war, in the naval force. And, a lot of people hedged their bets, including the United States. We built battleships. We built the Iowa class.
Yep.
Well past the time when a lot of people were saying that we shouldn't have built them anymore. And although they never fulfilled the role that, Jackie Fisher had envisioned for them, they were still damn handy assets that we activated 40 years later.
That's right.
Well, AJ, just got on a few hits on your other carriers.
I saw that
over here as well, just to add a little bit of insult to injury. But yeah, this is a wild scrum. We don't have much of a formation left here, do we? These ships are kind of every which way and kind of entangled in a fur ball in the middle. But
this would have been at least, especially if the destroyers were more to scale, this would have been up there for one of the larger surface engagements of World War II.
But obviously, having Japanese battleships within firing range of American carriers is not is not a scenario that any commander would have ever wanted to see. But so, boy, I think we've come to the end here. This is the end of term 12, and unfortunately, the Enterprise is at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. So it looks like this one is going to be chalked up as a Japanese victory.
Well, we'll win the war. It'll be all right.
But I have to say, AJ, you did have me sweating here because I really was considering my aircraft to be my main tool that I was going to use to try and win the game. And I really was sweating it out thinking, oh, I launched them too late. And you saw, actually, only one of them did end up getting close enough to even take a shot. So it was actually the surface forces and the submarines.
Yeah, well, that's really what surprised me. I suspected some shenanigans when I didn't see your aircraft carriers. I suspected something like that, which is why I kept my fleet together, and I actually moved the fleet together across Iron Bottom Sound over to Cape Esperance and the Army forces to keep everything concentrated together in case your aircraft did do that. So I was prepared for your aircraft to do that. I thought the rest of your battleships and cruisers were behind your screening force, which is why I did not adequately prepare, and I probably should have scouted more. I think that was my big mistake here, was underestimating the threat of your surface ships suddenly deploying and coming in and unleashing gunfire on the carriers. I just did not expect that.
Well, before we go too far down the review and thinking about it, I did want to ask Mark if Mark, you can take us through kind of just a very simple and abbreviated version of the kind of, debrief and after action review you do in professional war games. So can you take us through that and just, ask us some of the questions you might ask the players and take us through that?
Yeah, I certainly can. As we can watch this play out, it's for entertainment, right? It's for fun. We get to watch the ships shooting other ships and whatnot. But the results wind up being fairly similar. And the kinds of things that, if you're really looking at figuring out how to play this game better, the questions that I would ask would be, not just what happened, but why. When you made a certain decision, what at that point did you think to make that decision, and what were you trying to do, right? That's easy question. It's a very complex answer. And in some cases, it's fairly intuitive. You're going to have to dig back into your tacit knowledge and figure out what you thought you were trying to do. Some other things that we would ask players at times would be, when did you first understand that what you were doing either was working or wasn't working? What were the indicators and warnings? This is not something that they'll think of on the spot. A competent commander will mitigate risk by that. He'll have a series of information requirements that he will ask of his intelligence folks to say, let me know when they're doing this, because that means that, we're not it's not working. We would ask questions like that. Other questions about opportunity. When you saw the enemy doing this, did they show you a flank as an example? Did you find that you had a capability that it didn't look like the enemy understood that you had in a position that you could use it? So a lot of those kinds of things that are, none of them are particularly surprising. Mm-hmm. If you had certain pieces of kit, the question I would probably ask you, Rob, is you've got a superb torpedo capability. Were I to ask you again, why didn't you put your submarines out farther ahead of your surface forces to screen your evacuation? Those kinds of things, because you've got an ability to have that asymmetric weapon. And the torpedo from the cruiser was one that probably did most of the mortal damage, right? But how many Japanese submarines were responsible for sinking U.S. capital ships? Yorktown was certainly the victim of a submarine. Their torpedoes were magnificent.
I would, if I can, that's a good question for me. And I would say, in the beginning, I had my submarines, if you remember, kind of in a line here. I was thinking you were going to push forward to really get to where you knew I was going to be evacuating from. And so I was expecting you to come to me, basically. And if I could keep the submarines there, I was hoping and thinking you were going to sail right over them and I'd have a bunch of shots. But you didn't do that. So at that point, I realized, I'm going to have to move them out and kind of push forward and go find you. And in terms of when I knew this was working, I would say not until the very end. I kind of knew my main problem was trying to find you. My main hope again was winning by getting that capital ship. One of the reasons I decided to split everything up the way I did was because I figured if I had somebody in the west, somebody in the north, and somebody in the east, and they were all coming towards the center, I knew I was bound to find you eventually. I kind of had all the the approaches covered, so that kind of limited where you could be. And I figured the sooner I could find you, hopefully, the quicker I could start actually engaging you.
Yeah, the question I would have for AJ would be, what were you trying to accomplish by bringing your capital ships into restricted water space?
Yeah, that's a good point. Is the return worth the risk? I suppose I just had a little bit of this. I wanted to keep fleet integrity and I wanted to move my forces together. I knew I wanted to move some surface ships forward, so I thought that leaving my aircraft carriers behind would be they'd be very vulnerable to a possible airstrike or the enemy if they didn't have their escorts available. So I think that was my error, was bringing maybe the aircraft carriers with the entire fleet. Maybe perhaps I should have kept things divided, or maybe kept them out of the scenario entirely. Maybe that was the right decision.
There's a game mechanics question that may have forced your hand here. The size of your map board. Do you have anything south of Guadalcanal on your map board?
No, I do not.
Okay, so that's so it kind of limits you, that you more or less had to. You were vulnerable to Japanese ships coming in from the north and from the east. Really, if you're Halsey and you're going to be trying to interdict this, you're likely putting your carriers south of the island at a place where you are almost at the maximum range of your carrier-based aviation to go get these guys. Why? Because it means they can't get you, right? You want to maximize your ability to have combat power in a place where you're not particularly vulnerable. Yes, you mass, but you're not massing your force for the sake of it. You're massing combat power. So if you didn't have that part of the board, then you are absolved of your mismanagement of taxpayers' money there for sinking the carrier.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, there is this kind of, they call the edge of the world situation where the artificial map limit is, you can see here, there is some sea room on the kind of the southeast corner, but and this is the edge where the Japanese carriers came in from up here. So theoretically, I guess, AJ, you could have sent your carriers somewhere down in here where they probably would have been, but I guess then there would have been the potential. our two carriers could have found each other almost unescorted, and that
he's
was
not out of the way there.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
and interestingly, where did Halsey have his carriers? He had them, south of the island. He had the island in between the Japanese and himself, and not with reason. So you didn't have the map board for it. So again, some of the context of the game forces your choices. But that would have been, had we had a full board, what are you doing in there? If your aircraft have a 300 nautical mile range, you should be about 260 nautical miles away.
Exactly.
Now that comes with risk. That comes with risk too, obviously, because if they have, and again, airplanes didn't play as much in this, but if you had the ability to trace where his aircraft came from, Rob, then you can kind of find his carriers. I mean, we did it at Midway. We watched their destroyer go heading back toward their main force. There are ways to find his carriers, and an asymmetric weapon like a submarine's torpedo or a destroyer's torpedo is asymmetric for a reason. Am I willing to trade a submarine for a fleet carrier every day of the week and twice on Sunday? Certainly were. The Japanese certainly were.
Yeah, I think that part does ring true. And yeah, I think Mark, your point is a good one. The plane has a lot farther range than the big gun. Big gun's got a long range, plane has more, and it always will. So, that's a really good point. And I think it speaks to Halsey's actual reasoning. Halsey's about as aggressive as they come for a naval commander. And even he would never even have dreamed, I think, to deploy his carriers into Iron Bottom Sound. So
no, I will at least admit
Iron Bottom Sound. Why would you put your carriers there?
I will at least admit, AJ, that you were forced by the scenario somewhat to do what you did. So you're absolved at least of some of that blame. But
of some of that. But I definitely should have been scouting more of the north to find where your capital ships were. And I thought I checked, but I think you maybe deployed them there late. I think that was a real good move by you, because I checked it. They weren't there early, and I think then you deployed as soon as my destroyer went away. So they were off map, and then they came in right there. So that was my big mistake right there. I was kind of ready for the carriers. I thought you might have deployed them over there. I was not ready for the surface fleet, another separate surface fleet, to come in from the north like that. So that was my big mistake.
It was fortuitous because I didn't see when you searched that area, but I did. Yeah, I had planned to bring them on sort of in the middle of the game, and hoping that it would have sown enough confusion from the fact that you hadn't found them yet, that would have caused so much uncertainty that you might have, changed your plans or just kind of stopped for a while trying to figure out what to do. So, but it was a very fine line to walk because, again, I mean, they barely got into the fight in time. I mean, if this had been one turn shorter, I probably wouldn't have pulled it off. So.
That was close. That was really close. And I think you certainly did pay for your victory. I think it was a really close fought thing, but I did lose. So good game. And thank you very much, Mark, for
you're most welcome.
Adjudicating.
Yeah. No, that was great. This is we're just about over at an hour here, so I think this is a good place to leave it. But thank you very much to AJ for playing, to Mark for offering your commentary. That was all really great, and I had a great time. And yes, it was helped by the fact that I won, but but I mean, it was a great learning experience too. And just again, kind of feeling, even in this completely no stress environment, just to feel that uncertainty and tension building, it helps put you in the mindset of figuring out, now you can understand why real life commanders did what they did, or at least understand a little bit.
a little bit. We got, I think, even the most tippy tip of the iceberg as far as how in-depth wargaming can go. But I think you do experience it a little tiny bit.
But thank you everyone again for watching. And again, if you're watching this late or you came in late, you can see the full replay of this on our Facebook page or on YouTube if you just search for Naval War College Museum. We will be doing more of these games in the near future, so please monitor our social media sites again to find out when the next one will be. And thank you very much again for watching. Have a great night, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Rob. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.